Travis and the staff at
Of course, right now.
Texas Tech. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, yes.
University Press uh, for publishing this
Well, if you can,
memoir of my dear friend Jake Berto, and thanks to Kristen and Diane for I don't know, their ongoing devotion and vision for the Sowell Family Collection Archive. They've really given me a home away from home. Um, my friend and neighbor Ron Paget, who's a poet and translator, but he's also somebody who has written a number of very intimate uh, biographical memoirs, if you will, of his poet and artist friends such as Joe Brainerd and Ted Berrigan and Dick Gallup. And I wanted just to mention that because sort of friendship seems to become a late in life subject for both Ron and I. I'm putting me in his purview there. And but he is a sort of model for me in this small memoir. And then the photographer and artist and wonderful writer Bill Barrett, he in conversations helped me understand what qualities such a small, brief book could have. And so just those are just thank yous to those people. Um, I'm going to read a very brief passage from The Wound is the Place the Light Enters. And I should just preface it to say when this conversation that I'm going to read took place, Jake was very ill uh, with leukemia. And I noticed on my visits, which were quite frequent, that there were certain subjects that seemed to inspirit him. I mean, he really would drift off for long periods, but there were certain subjects, especially about painting. And so I'm going to read a small section. And we were talking, and it was an evening, and I didn't really write about this, but Jake likes soup. And so I would come and make soup. And then he would say, well, I'm not really liking this soup. And so I would have the ingredients for another soup. And on this particular evening or around this time, I had made 3 or 4 different soups until he finally decided. And he was awake and we weren't sleeping, and it was an insomniac visit. And we got to talking about angels. He was very interested in angels in historical paintings. And so I'm going to read a little section. This is the first time we've really talked about this subject. Now that I think about it, I said. Okay, Jake said, well, let me give you an example. What comes to mind, I haven't thought of this in ages, this 17th century epic poem. I can't remember how I discovered it. Actually, I think it may have been from Milton Resnick in The Village. What year? This is by way transcribed from a tape recording in the 60s. Or maybe I heard it from a poet that my first wife, Jenny, knew. I can't quite remember. The 17th century epic poem was written by someone named Haywood. The title was Hierarchy of Angels, but it wasn't so much the poem as the engraved plates that went with it. I remember thinking of those angels, choreographically in a way. Some were radically tilted high in the air, like they couldn't hold their balance, falling in a contorted kind of way, like an Egon Schiele contorted figure falling. I remember that some of the angels looked bored or uninterested, but others seemed to have this look of astonishment, and a couple looked frightened. Of what? Who knows? I remember in one of the engraved plates was an angel that had a striking resemblance in the construction of its face, a striking resemblance to my father. That freaked me out. I didn't know what the hell to make of that. Let's see, what else? There's a line from some Polish poet: until you lowly eaters of bread will be made into angels. I did a couple of drawings inspired by that line. Byzantine and medieval angels, into the Renaissance, Fra Angelica's The Annunciation, the classical Erotes, or from the Italian Renaissance. I mean, I didn't question the theological assumptions behind these works. I studied them as paintings, like any good student of art must. Which others are you remembering right now? I said. The Archangel Gabriel, he said, in Deacon's Vestments, that Dutch masterpiece, Jan van Eyck. I think it's titled The Annunciation. That's 15th century. And I love so many of the Persian angels, angels in Mecca. They're really beautiful works. I like Chagall's Jacob's Dream. I think I saw that in a museum in Nice. Angels all over that canvas. Giotto's Crying Angels. I mean, you look at expressions on those angels' faces of Giotto's angels in that painting, and it's like a whole range of human emotion, or maybe some emotions people no longer even have expressions for, expressions only angels could have, something like that. And we talked about these angels for a while, and then the subject changed to the film of Wim Wenders' Wings of Desire, which I'm sure some of you know, and which is, of course, extraordinary. And Jake wanted to watch it. This was probably 3 or 4 in the morning now. And so we did. I had watched it with Jake years earlier and figured he probably still had the DVD on some shelf or other. I put more wood on the fire. I found the DVD and set it all up, and we didn't say a word for the duration of the film, which ran 2 hours and 8 minutes. The story is set in post-World War II Berlin. The narrator is an angel played by Bruno Ganz. Ganz' immediate cohort angel is played by Otto Sander, and I see the film as, in part, as a depiction of their friendship under the strangest of circumstances. Though the story can't be summarized in any way that does it justice, these two characters are more or less on assignment to eavesdrop on mortals and invent ways to comfort them in their quotidian distress. The whole thing is shot by cinematographer Henri Alekin, dominantly in sepia-toned black and white. At times, the soundtrack sounds as if it is being mumbled and hummed by Marlene Dietrich, suffering the rapture of her most disconsolate hours. The screenwriters Wim Wenders and Peter Handke declared that they were influenced by Rilke's, quote, desperate lyricism, and Homer's, quote, angel of storytelling. At one point, Bruno Ganz falls in love with a trapeze artist played by Salvi Domartin, whose loneliness, especially when she is depicted aloft on a trapeze, is precisely what inspired Jake's drawing. When news filtered to the angels, they were overwhelmed by their aloneness. I have the drawing right here. I'll see if I can show it. She's aloft, Jake said, but can't seem to rise above her own earthbound sadness. Anyway, Salvi Domartin is so consuming an object of desire for Bruno Ganz that he becomes mortal again, so he can experience all the tactile and sensory human pleasures and hopes to share love with the trapeze artist. So it is a romantic tragedy, a near theological melodrama, and a kind of monochromatic symphony on screen. When the film ended, Jake said, anyone who thinks this is all about death is crazy. It's about the nature of being alive. So the Bruno Ganz angel is being, but he wants to fully be human again, I said. Yeah. And it's so goddamn heartbreaking, really, Jake said. And so dark, but so full of surprising life, too. I mean, the city seems desperate for light. Ganz and Sander seem desperate for light, for it to enter them somehow. It reminds me of Jake stood up The cat scattered off, knocking over Jake's teacup. He more or less shuffled over to a nearby shelf. He found a collection of poems by the 13th century Persian poet Rumi. He sat back down on the sofa and paged through. Where is that? Where is that? And finally found what he was looking for. And he read, "The wound is the place the light enters you." So that's the source of the title. And so those were the kinds of conversations we were taping over a number of years. And thing about Jake is he was very introspective and very economical, usually in speech, until you got him talking about painting. And then he was logorrheic. He just had the most amazing erudition about painting. And I was in the most luxurious position with him because when you know so little, so much is a revelation. And talking to him, it would be like an education each time. And oddly enough, not didactic. I see my friend Lynn Bowers is here. Hi, Lynn. There's Lynn, a wonderful painter. So that's just a little section of the book. It's divided up into 4 or 5 short chapters. They are all mixed with taped conversations and remembered conversations and quotes from notebooks. So it really is a pastiche. I used W.S. Merwin's phrase was my guide, and his phrase was a pastiche of inimitable farewells. And so that's really sort of what guided me in writing this book, was remembering that at a certain point when you know somebody's dying, Jake would say, "I've never died before. How am I doing?" And I would say, "Well, you've never died before. How am I doing, as your friend?" And this was a kind of refrain that would go back and forth. And then at some point, we just decided to tape conversations, and that's some of the basis of this book. So, I mean, it's hard to really give perhaps an appropriate preface, but it really is a book that covers many, many years, but in time takes place really in one night, from middle afternoon all the way through to the next morning. And the one refrain that Jake started to use on the phone in almost daily conversations, but others, is he would say, "I'm human because I'm still breathing and can look out at trees, but I'm not a being because I can't get to my studio and work." So at the end of this memoir, sort of toward the end, we finally managed to get out on this cold winter night to his studio. We're only able to stay a very short time, really a matter of a few minutes. But and the studio was only about 20 yards from the house. But we finally got out there, and there were a lot of works in progress, of course, which he never was able to return to. So it's elegiac in that regard. So that's my little introduction, Travis. I don't know where we go from here. If people want
No, that's
to
fine.
ask some questions, or
I'm going to emerge from my normal place in the editorial shadows. I'm Travis. I'm editor-in-chief at Texas Tech University Press, and I had the distinct honor and pleasure of working with Howard on this book and working with Kristen and Diane and Kurt on other books like it. One of our thoughts behind bringing out books that relate to the Sowell collection, excuse me, was to really give authors like Howard more of a blank canvas, more of a director's cut. As he's describing it, and as we sort of, I think we've all kind of struggled to describe this book at varying points because it's a strange artifact. It's a conversation that takes place over an evening, but it's also a reminiscence of a friendship. And all of these things, again, as Howard said, pastiche together. And one of the, I think, the great pleasures of working at a university press is that I don't have to worry about what this is in the way that I think some of my colleagues at Penguin Random House do. They need to know if it's a thriller or a romance or a mid-list book or things to that tune. And it's a very freeing thing to be able to give Howard kind of space to roam and space to sort of work out what this is as it's becoming what it is. So that was the sort of the philosophy behind this initiative, these Sowell books, as it sort of trickled down to this particular book. And Howard, I actually was really wanting to ask you, when did this take shape in your head as a book? You talked about you realizing that you should record these conversations, but there's sort of the gap between that revelation and the stitching it all together as a to be published artifact. So could you talk about that process for you?
Yeah. It sort of takes place in 2014 in November, and I had left Jake's house, and he hadn't presented himself that night, that November night, as being able to be very mobile. But I went out and I fell asleep for a couple hours and then got in the car and left. And when I left, I realized that I shouldn't be leaving. And I called my wife Jane, and I said, I just feel like this is a mistake. But Jake really needed his time to be alone. And when I got back to Washington, D.C., where I was living at the time, the back of my car was entirely filled with drawings. And so somehow, while I was asleep, Jake got out to this storage space and put these drawings in there. I had no idea that this had happened. And when I was driving back, I really realized that he had kind of given me a structure for this book, which was the structure was really his associational manner of speaking. So he would introduce something with great passion and great articulation, but then leave it. And so it left you with the anticipation of what the rest was going to be. He would leave it, and he would leave it sometimes for days or weeks or months, and then come back around. So I thought that associational kind of writing would make an interesting small book. Yeah. And we talked on the phone about it. And he said, yes, I don't even know why you're bringing this up. Haven't you gotten a lot of indications from me that I would like you to write something? But when you're in denial about somebody dying, you don't want to think about anything that's a permanently elegiac in form. So it took me a while. And there's letters, everything is thrown in here: letters, diaries, conversations, tapes, so on. It had originally 3 more chapters, Travis. You'll probably be glad to know that you didn't have to deal with that.
Well, what was in those 3 chapters that I didn't get?
And one of the chapters was just so it was just driving around trying to locate this particular birch tree in this national park that Jake had drawn. He gave me a notebook of 30 drawings of this. And we went back to this national park near where he was living in upstate New York, and he couldn't find the tree. And we literally just drove around for, I would say, 4 or 5 hours And, he wasn't happy with this.
Yeah.
He was very agitated about this. And we were driving back, and I said, well, let's stop to get something to eat. And we were eating, and he looked at me and he said, it wasn't in the national park. So it was really about a mile from his house, but he had remembered it wrong. But the misremembering led to this wonderful day of trying to find a tree that didn't exist in the place we were looking.
Yeah.
But when I looked at that chapter, I thought there's really no subject except like the miles we put on and the things we talked about and his escalating frustration. And so I didn't put that, I didn't make a chapter out of that.
So I take it that the two men not succeeding in finding a tree did not make the sort of the final cut.
Two
Um,
men, two men trying but not succeeding, finally finding a tree might have been a good title.
yeah, there we go. There we go. That's a Samuel Beckett play, I
Yeah,
think.
exactly. And then there was another chapter which really had to do with um, the more, I would say, the more personal circumstances around a series of red paintings, which were completely about grief, and they had to do with going to see these paintings with the writer Grace Paley, and her comments on them. She didn't know Jake, but she saw a lot in those paintings, and one was called "Grief for That Past," and so these were very emotionally charged
Yeah.
works. But when I looked at that chapter, I thought it felt fraudulent to me. It just didn't feel, it felt more like trying to describe something that didn't need description.
Yeah.
So it was that kind of editorial decision.
Understood.
Yeah.
I think both Kristen and I have shared now links to an exhibit at the Betty Cunningham Gallery, which of course is of Jake Berto's work. I wonder, Howard, if you could, if neither of us are painters, but I wonder if you could give a short introduction to what sort of is sort of notable about Jake's art, or how it
Oh,
is
goodness.
if you're sort of introducing his work to a room full of strangers, what would you say
Yeah.
about it?
Well, some of the people, like Lynn Bowers, knows the work. Um, Jake started out really as a, I guess, almost classic abstract expressionist. He was very much under the influence of Milton Resnick, and then he befriended Philip Guston, and Guston got him to rethink a number of things. Um, this book is really about the last decade of Jake's life. He moved from, um, I guess one would say, abstract painting to landscape painting. But you know, if one reads this book, you'll see how he found that those were abstract paintings as well. They were just clear, recognizable subject matter. But his signature grids that he always, under every painting and every drawing, there's a grid. And sometimes he would leave the grids open to be seen. I wish I could show you some of the drawings here. That there's beautiful trees and botanically accurate trees, but around them are these grids, which was the structure underneath. And sometimes you'd walk into Jake's studio and you'd see 8 or 10 paintings of just grids. And they would sit there for a month or so, and then he would go to that canvas or that paper and draw whatever he was drawing over them. So the last decade or so of his life, with a couple of exceptions, one would have been a series called Artists and Model, and they were a series of 26 drawings. Again, I wish I could show you some of them, of artist model configurations. There were a lot of angels in those too, floating around in the sky. he always had an observing figure like that.
Yeah.
And he did 4 skull drawings of skulls and paintings of skulls, but predominantly he drew trees and landscape. He went back to Cezanne and would have these Cezanne paintings all over the house. I mean, reproductions of them, and paint landscapes. But I would say, crudely put, maybe 85% of what he was doing were drawings and paintings of trees. In the last 2 years of his life, he went back to the painter Ryder for those crepuscular times of day and those rather haunting things where you can't quite tell if it's dawn or dusk. And so he had a series of those going when he passed away. So his arc over the decades really was quite dynamic, oftentimes very experimental, and always drawings and paintings. There was no period of time where he wasn't working on both. Even at the beginning, the first 5 or 6 exhibits, there was no exhibits of drawings, but he was doing a lot of drawings.
Yeah.
So that may not do him justice. He was often called a painter's painter, which was a phrase he just loathed.
Yeah.
Just cringed when he heard that.
I can imagine. I'm going to break a hosting rule. I'm going to tell a very short story of my own about Howard's book, and want to use it as a way to sort of wedge in another sort of act to this conversation. And I grew up as a suburban Midwestern teenager with a lot of pretentious arty friends who were where we would watch old French movies that we sort of acted like gave us some sort of cachet, or we read mid-century American fiction. We read good poetry. We wrote bad poetry. We played in bands, but mostly these were friendships that predicated on talk, late night talk, sitting around reading things and talking some more. And I had one certain friend where we would pass a notebook back and forth between each other. These were probably from age 15 to 20. And sometimes he would hide the book in my mailbox and text me, said it's out there. And allegedly it still exists, much to my horror, in someone's basement, just a lurking, embarrassing artifact. But this friend and I, we lost touch for a while, reconnected again over letters about books that meant a lot to us, art that meant a lot to us. He had become a painter, and we talked about subjects of his art and his development as an artist. And it turns out that this old friend worked his way into becoming a freelance copy editor. And the funniest thing about all of this is that I ended up hiring this friend to copy edit Howard's book. So
Really.
I tell this story because it's also like the subject of the book is it's friendship and these conversations that you have late at night. But Howard, I wanted to hear you talk about friendship as a literary subject, and you had mentioned it as you had come to it later, which reading some of your other books, I'm not so sure, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how writing a book centered on friendship, how that's different from other kinds of writing, and what you think about it.
Well, that's a very generous question, Travis. It's complicated a little bit. I'm moving from fiction to nonfiction now, and sort of for whatever interest that is, and I have these 3 or 4 books that are really predicated around somewhat difficult but deeply rewarding friendships. And the first one was a book called In Fond Remembrance of Me. It came out some years ago, and it was about a woman that I worked with in the Arctic who was the most influential person in my life, still is. And I left that realm of friendship for a long time. But as one gets older and this sounds a little pretentious, but starts losing friends, it strikes deeper chords. And so the book about Jake, a book of letters that I sent Bill Merwin, W.S. Merwin from Japan, ended up to be an epistolary biography of our friendship. I wasn't just writing about what I was seeing in Japan, but remembering stuff that he and I had gone through. And it started to occur to me late in life that friendship was provisional, that you really just simply had to constantly work at it in some ways. And oftentimes with me, it was in letters. And then a mutual friend of a number of people that are signed in tonight, the great, cartoonist Ed Koren, we started creating a book not unlike this one in the last 2 years, where we would meet once every 2 weeks at Three Penny Tap Room and look at haiku and look at drawings and talk. And that became another collection. So somehow friendship, which is really an Old Testament, if you look closely at it, and then I got very, very interested in epistolary relations between people who really were separated by historical events, such as Catherine Mansfield and her husband, who wrote 2,800 letters during the war. And they worked out all these marital problems at a distance without having to actually experience the marital problems. And I got very interested in letters as a phenomenon. And during COVID, the first years of COVID, that's all I read was collections of letters. And they were astonishing treatises on friendship. And so that's really what I'm kind of doing now. And Jake's book is more, how should I say it? It's more exclusively about friendship.
Yeah.
Than the others.
I would say so. That actually segs nicely into some questions we have growing. And I want to start with a question about letters and as a form of communication, which sort of popped up in the chat. And so Matthew is asking if the more sort of immediate forms of sort of technologically assisted communication that we have now, like right now we're on Zoom, or there's texting, or there's phone calls. How is that, or how have letters been so different, so formative, and how do these other forms of communication? What are the pros and cons to you?
Yeah, I mean, I remember asking my mother what it was like to see television, and she said, without irony, she said, well, Jack Benny was much more handsome on the radio. And I thought, so if you see something, you actually don't have to imagine it in a certain way. And when she died, she left this box, and I just let it sitting around the house for the longest time. And finally, I opened it and with my daughter, and it turned out that she had saved this notebook that I had written in sixth grade, and they were all marriage proposals. I had essentially written long marriage proposals to every single person, in every single girl in my class, and including the teacher. And and my mother would always say, when I got upset, she would say, write that person a letter, but don't send it. And that was her nature, to vent it, but not confront. But as I got older, I started thinking about that a lot. And I thought, if you write a letter, but you don't send it, you've constructed an unrequited relationship with the world. And it's six of one, half dozen the other. And I think it was around that time, around age 19 or 20, when I was traveling to remote areas and spending a lot of time alone, that I started writing letters. And lo and behold, I wake up in my early 70s and realize that like there were maybe 13 or 1400 letters to Merwin and postcards, and it was habitual, reporting back from whatever place, just chatty letters. God knows what these people thought of this, who would receive these. And I think they've always just been important. They still are. I still like to type letters. We had a little book gathering for Tom Absher for a new book of poems. And after that, Tom sent a handwritten letter. And I know that sounds artifactual. I know it sounds like another century, but it's rare and rare and rarer and rarer. Our daughter still writes letters. And I think emails, I do write long email letters, but it does not feel the same way as typing or writing. And so with the Merwin book, such as it is, looking at the letters that he saved the letters I sent him from Japan, and then he sent them to me. And I didn't remember writing those letters. I remembered writing to him, but I didn't remember that the cumulative effect of all those letters was actually a kind of biography of our friendship, the ups and downs, and there were some real ups and downs. I didn't remember writing that part. So I think the old habit of wanting to get at something with another person through an exchange of letters has never left me.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I think that what we write to other people, what we say to other people are some of the hardest things to remember. But of course, it's so easy for the person who's heard them to remember. So to see what you said refracted back to you is
Yes.
such
It
a
was
surreal.
shocking how upset I still was about something that had happened 30 years before.
Yeah.
It's not, it didn't reflect well on me, I thought.
Yeah.
But
Tough to see, I'm sure.
I should have called Pema Chodron and asked her how to calm down.
Perfect. Diane Fitch wants to hear the story of how you and Jake met, and so do I, because I always find painters to be a little intimidating. So I'm curious about what the early meeting was like and how the friendship began.
I think that Philip Roth was right that he said secretly all writers want to be either painters or musicians. There's something about that. I met Jake through my wife, Jane. Jane, when I met her in about 1980 in Cambridge, was already very much an established poet. She had worked with Elizabeth Bishop and Robert Lowell. She was somebody who had a circle of literary kind of circle. I did not. I never thought about being a writer really fully. And when we went to New York, she said, well, we're going to stay at the loft of a painter friend of mine. And so they left keys, and we went into this loft in the village, and there was this bed and this gigantic painting over the bed, just enormous painting. And I never made any connection. I didn't realize it was the owner of the loft's painting. And then Jane said, well, we're at Jake's apartment and so on and so forth. And then we met at dinner, I think it was. And less than a month after that, we started exchanging letters. So that was a long, not more than a month ever went by without a letter, certainly a lot of phone calls. And then I started teaching summer course at the New York State Writers Institute in upstate New York. And it was about 40-minute drive from that to Jake's house. And I would oftentimes teach during the day and then drive down and spend the night at Jake's place, and sometimes 5 or 6 times during the week, just to get together and so forth. But I didn't know his painter friends. I didn't know many people in the orbit that he was in, the dealers, the New York art world. I met them glancingly, but I was not friends or acquaintances with them. I think it freed him up to talk about them in a way that he might not have. Dory Ashton, they had a long relationship. And that's how I met. It was due to Jane, who really adored Jake, and then he became a family friend as well. So it was really because of her.
Mm-hmm. I think that one of the things that we've talked about sort of the arc of Jake's career, and one of the ways that people simplify and describe it is by the increasing presence of more discernible figures in his drawing. I think one of the other ways that folks simplify it is talking about when he moved from New York City to the country, to put it in shorthand. And it really, for some folks, represents an artistic pivot. I wonder if you could talk about physical space in your own work a little bit. This is a very Sal family collection kind of question.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about movement and space and setting and how that frames your practice.
I mean, I think it's interesting, and it is applicable because, watching Jake paint and going out to finding trees and moving into the landscape this way, he never saw as new. He saw the paintings as new, but the if you will, the kind of wandering scholarship that he did, he was always working with ideas in sketchbooks. So you see a lot of the sketchbooks from the early days were full of drawings of trees. But he didn't, and in the margins of his letters, there would often be trees, but it never coalesced, if you will, or never organized itself as a full devotion or a full commitment till that last 10 years or so. But in talking with him about landscape, especially the landscape in paintings, really helped me try to describe landscape. And Jake actually changed me a lot because he said, well, I gave him a manuscript of a book, and he said, the problem with this book as it stands is the landscape isn't developed the same way you develop a human character. And I just had never heard that before, that it's a sentient presence, and it has phenomenal influence on the characters in these novels set up in the Canadian Maritimes. But I never thought of it. So it was really his articulation of landscape painting that created a kind of possible aesthetic for me. And I wish I knew how to be more influenced by it.
I remember reading a collection of lectures by Ruskin, and and he of course talked about it in the same way, where it wasn't they didn't sound like lectures of a painter, they sounded like lectures of a scientist, where like here's why the rocks are layered this way, here's how the trees grow.
Yeah.
And then finally at the very end he talked about how, and if you want to truly capture something, if you want to truly paint it, then you have to know all of these core truths about the way that things are in nature. And seeing how that would become focalized through someone who was landscape oriented as Jake was, even in his early, more abstract paintings, they still strike me as very sort of landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. And he, when he would come to Vermont, we would do something each time, which was drive over to the Athenaeum in St. Johnsbury, where there's a big Bierstadt painting, huge painting, of course, no people in it.
Yeah.
And it just would sit there, and like I would walk around town and shop and go grocery shopping, and he would just sit there for several hours looking at that painting. And the painters who are in our group tonight will understand that his studio was just filled with influences. These Cezanne paintings and these and when he started to paint trees fully, there were just a lot of examples of historical trees. I kind of list them in this book, the ones he loved the most. Van Gogh and others, he just really studied. He didn't have a scholarly vocabulary. He had an aesthetic vocabulary, and it was variable. He could be off-puttingly dismissive of a painting that, for instance, in my unlettered way, that I adored. And he made it his modus operandi of an evening to explain me out of liking that painting. He had a lot of certitudes that were somewhat inflexible. And yet, so I learned to navigate around those. And so, yeah, I learned a lot about landscape. You may not recognize it in those novels, but he was a huge influence on me in terms of thinking about landscape.
I'm so glad to hear about that, because it's such a trite thing to ask you about your influences, but to hear it extolled through the deep story of a relationship, it really makes it such a rich thing. And I'll note that we did get some of Jake's paintings into the book. So for those who do end up reading it, those do, I think, provide nice counterpoints to the conversation and the pastiche and the collage effect of what Howard is doing.
There's a drawing there. I don't know if you can see it.
Yeah,
it's the one about the angels hearing news, and they're wonderful to live with. And the reason I ended the book the way I did was, or began it, I should say, is that this uncanny thing happened, especially after Jake died. In Vermont, of course, right, not now, but soon, the trees will be bare. And there's a lot of trees of the species that Jake painted right around the farmhouse here. And they would be around Tom and Erica's house and people up here. And the first winter after Jake died, or that very winter he died, I realized something had happened to me, that I was not able to look at those trees as, how should I say it, as autonomous. I was seeing Jake's trees and then having to work through those trees to get to the real tree. I'm not articulating it very well, but it seemed like the world was a simulacrum. And the memory of these trees, and the trees in the house here and drawings, were more tangible presences. And in some ways that's still true. I don't really know how to analyze that or talk about it with any psychological acuity, but it still happens. And you could look at it as a form of mourning somebody, a form of just how somebody affects your perceptions of things. But it is a phenomenology that continues. And it's not happening yet because there's still wonderful leaves on the trees, but it will soon. And it's just, it's connected the outdoors to the indoors in a way. Because I see these bare trees and I say, well, Jake would have painted that one or drawn that one. And then look on the wall and there's, one of these drawings. And so that's landscape, I suppose.
Yeah. That's literature. That's art. I think I'm going to let Howard that answer serve as kind of a beginning of a close here because we're nearly at time. And I think you've so nicely summarized how life bled into this work and how it sort of I think that's really what good reading does is it gives you a new lens through which to view the world. And that's
So we see if anybody has a question. I doubt it, but if anybody does.
We have had a couple come through and I've relayed them. If there are any more, I am happy to feel free to just unmute and shout it out if you've got one, but no worries if you don't. No. I'm going to let Kristen Lloyd attend to any kind of closing remarks or business that there remains to be done.
Thank you, Howard. Thank you, Travis. That was a lovely conversation. Just a quick reminder that the Sowell Collection will be hosting a series of virtual readings starting October 17th. We are featuring Indigenous authors with their debut works. I'll send out an email to everybody here tonight to allow you guys to read a little bit more about them and then hopefully join us. And then if you're in Lubbock, we are also partnering with the Museum of Texas Tech and the Barry Lopez Foundation to do a series of events around an exhibit at the museum called From Here to the Horizon, Photographs in Honor of Barry Lopez. So we'd be delighted to have you there as well. Thank you so much, you guys. This has been one of the best ones we've had, so thank you so much.